I'm Jackie Brinton. I am the chair of the Religious Studies Department. And I want to thank our co-sponsors tonight, which are the Spencer Museum, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Department of Visual Art. And I also really want to thank Patrisse Cullors for coming to campus, for being with us this evening. So thank you, Patrisse.
Thank you so much, team, and thank you so much, Dr. Nakia Roberts, Robert, not plural, for inviting me out. We've known each other for a long time, and it's an honor. I've had you all have really welcomed me to Kansas. I have not been to the state before, not to be confused with Kansas City, because I have been there. I had a whole back and forth, like, what's it, Kansas or Kansas City? It's Kansas City, Missouri. And I'm just honored to be in conversation with this team about our collective imagination and how abolition can get us there. I grew up in a community and neighborhood that was riddled by police violence. Really grew up in a community suffering at the hands of the carceral system, and from a very early age witnessed the decimation of an entire neighborhood and wondered why us, why our community, why were we being subjected to this level of trauma and harm. And while the mainstream media was saying because we deserved it, that our families were super predators, that our community didn't deserve investment. In fact, our community was deeply divested from. In my spirit, I knew that wasn't true. I lived amongst some of the most beautiful community. We took care of each other, we supported each other, we leaned on each other. And in that experience, I knew that what I was watching on mainstream news in the 90s and what I was experiencing in real life in my community were two very different worlds. I was very blessed because I was an artist. And I think more and more people are seeing that I'm an artist. Many people know me as the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. But in my artist practice, I recognize something really true, which is building out the individual imagination was a place that helped me cope with the level of trauma and violence that I was experiencing. But also, as I grew up and became politicized and joined the movement, I understood that the collective imagination was actually where we'd be set free. And so much of what we'll be talking about tonight is the collective imagination and how abolition takes us there. Abolition and imagination are deeply intertwined concepts, with imagination serving as the vital engine that drives the abolitionist movement towards envisioning and creating a world free of oppressive systems. This synergy is fundamental because abolition is not merely about tearing down existing structures, but crucially about reimagining and reconstructing them in ways that uphold justice and equity for all. This idea of imagination of abolition isn't just about one single community. In fact, the concept of abolition is about all of us. It's about how we show up with each other. It's about how we show up inside of our institutions and how they show up for us. The role of imagination in abolition: one, envisioning alternatives. At its core, abolition requires us to imagine alternatives to our current system of justice. I learned today from Emmeline when I had a studio visit about Kansas's use of predatory billing, medical billing. And what I learned from that conversation is the agency's relationship to the court system. And so one could say abolition would also deeply impact the healthcare system, right? It's a challenge to the big business of healthcare. I grew up in a city and a county called Los Angeles, city and county, that deeply invested in jails and prisons. In fact, for almost a decade, there was going to be built a $3.5 billion jail. And when the community realized the county's investment in a $3.5 billion jail, organizers got to work. And we started to go door to door and we started to meet with individuals and we said to them, hey, what would you do with $3.5 billion? Not a single human being said build a jail or prison. In fact, it was quite the opposite. We would resource educational systems, we would resource green spaces and parks, we would have people have access to healthy food, to adequate public education. And so the abolitionist imagination really can start with what is happening in real time in your own location. The second part of the abolitionist imagination is inspiring collective action. So imagination fuels hope and mobilizes people. It transforms the abstract idea of a better world into tangible goals and strategies that communities can really rally around. This is crucial in building the broad-based movements necessary for societal change. There was a time in history where nobody thought we'd get rid of chattel slavery. There was a time in history where the very fabric of this country relied on chattel slavery. And abolitionists, time and time again, challenged chattel slavery, and eventually that system went down. But what happened after that, right? The system of policing and the system of imprisonment. And so we still have a long ways to go for this abolitionist future and imagination. Number 3, we have to challenge perceived limits. Imagination challenges the perceived inevitability of current conditions. How many times, and this is where you get our audience participation, how many times have you said to someone, we can change this thing, and their response back is, there's no way we can change it? Raise your hand if you've heard that before.
I don't have enough hands for that.
Correct. And so this idea of challenging ourselves, challenging our individual imagination, it starts with us. What do you believe is to be true? What do you believe is possible? And so we have to start with ourselves. And inside of that, we have to believe it first. When I first started doing community organizing work, I got really good advice from an elder. And he said to me, there's no way you can organize somebody if you do not believe it yourself. And so, what do you believe in? And the abolitionist imagination requires us to believe in something wholly different than what we are witnessing right now, the system we are living in right now. And it doesn't mean that we're going to imagine something different and then overnight it's going to change. No, it takes practice, it takes commitment, and it takes a long haul vision. So abolitionist imagination and action. I really believe, this is like a core belief of mine, that the artists and creatives are the ones that are going to set us free. Sitting with I think it was 4 MFA students today was deeply inspiring, listening to the work that you all are doing and how you're trying to dream big. I think artists actually ask us to imagine beyond our perceptions. And so artists, writers, organizers, activists often exemplify the power of abolitionist imagination. Through literature and art, activist campaigns, educational reforms, there are so many ways in which many different people across time and space, and currently right now, are changing the very fabric of this place. It feels quite beautiful to be talking about abolition here in this town, given all the things I've learned from Dr. Nakia about the role of John Brown here and the role of many abolitionists to keep this state a free state. And so, how do you cultivate the abolitionist imagination? What does that look like? And to cultivate an abolitionist imagination, it is vital to engage with diverse narratives and histories, participate in dialogues that challenge prevailing ideas, and create spaces that encourage experimental thinking. Workshops, community discussions, art installations, and interactive education could all serve as platforms to ignite and nurture the abolitionist imagination. And so, before I continue, I'm actually going to ask you to think of one abolitionist opportunity that you see here in this town, or maybe if you're more familiar with your own town, think about that one thing. What's the first thing that pops into your mind? And you're going to talk about it with the person next to you for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to bring you back into the conversation. Go for it. One abolitionist imagination. You can do it. I believe in you. Let's practice. So, the importance of viewing abolition within a new framework and belief system lies in its call for deep systemic changes, not just surface reforms. In fact, many of us abolitionists call them non-reformist reforms, right? What is the pipeline of reforms that's going to get us to the abolitionist imagination, not move us closer to carceral systems? For example, there was a huge fight about 6-7 years ago around body cameras, right? Let's pour millions and millions of dollars into body cameras, or millions and millions of dollars into training. Well, does that take us away from the carceral state? Does it have us lean into it? The biggest call to action that was a move towards abolition was in 2020, when folks were calling for the defunding of the police and really looking at a police budget. I got the I got the privilege of sitting with Dr. Robert's class earlier yesterday. Was that yesterday?
Yes.
Wow. And we looked at the Lawrence police budget. And from there, we're like, what would we do with $30 million? What could we do with that? And so this becomes a really important opportunity to think through, what are the reforms that actually get us closer to liberation and freedom? Historically, figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass come to mind, who not only fought against slavery, but also envisioned a world of Black autonomy and equity. And the 20th century, Angela Davis furthered these ideas, linking racial justice to broader social issues, advocating for the dismantling of what she calls the prison industrial complex as a modern form of slavery. And today, we have activist scholars like Miriam Kaba and the organizations like the Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter, who've continued this call for abolition. These abolitionists, both historical and contemporary, demonstrate the transformative power of envisioning a society that truly upholds the dignity and rights of all of its members. I have a lot more to say about this, but I really want to sit down with one of your professors. Last thing I'll just say is abolitionist principles, for me, are not wholly political. They're actually deeply spiritual. And they come with a framework and a belief system that we're divesting from an economy of punishment and we're investing in an economy of care. Imagine, just for a minute, if you can close your eyes with me, imagine a world where every single human being has their needs met, where we are not just intervening on harm, we're preventing it. Imagine where each one of us can actually give birth and feel and know that our children will be able to live long lives. Imagine every child being able to walk down the street and not worry about guns or brutality being faced by them. There's a possibility when we all collectively imagine together, there's a possibility that abolition can be true in our lifetimes. Ashe, thank you.
So I am ordained in the Black church, and some things we say is, come on, y'all can do better than that. Abolition imagination. And that I perceive as an invocation, right, and an invitation that invites us all to think outside of the boundaries of our institutions, the boundaries in which we are conditioned by punishment, these kind of fixed understandings of how we respond to harm, and to imagine other possibilities, to imagine alternatives, right, that are rooted in abolitionist goals and restorative justice to create healing and these communities of care. So really inspired by what you are framing in your discussion that invites us to imagine. So I want to ask you a few questions. I know you mentioned abolition in your presentation, but for those of us who are just coming along the abolition train, can you tell us, how do you define abolition?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it's a quite simple definition. It's the getting rid of police, prisons, surveillance, and all the carceral institutions that are aligned with police and prisons. But it's also, for me, bigger than that. Abolition is how we show up for each other. It's how we take care of each other. Abolition is not just the ending of political systems as we know it, but it's a reimagining of systems. And I like to say a reimagining, I said it at the ending of this, but a divestment from an economy of punishment or the economy of violence, as Angela Davis says, and an investment into an economy of care.
Very good, thank you. I'm interested, you have a book that gives kind of the 12 steps to abolition. And if I may, just to ensure that we're on the same page, I received this beautiful PR box when your book was released, and there's postcards that list each of the principles. And they are to commit to responding versus reacting, to light the U.S. state,
To stop the U.S. state.
fight the U.S. state rather than make it stronger, experiment, nothing is fixed, say yes to imagination, forgive actively, not passively, to allow yourself to feel, to commit to not harming or abusing others, to embrace non-reformist reforms, which we heard in the presentation, to build community, to value interpersonal relationships, to have courageous conversations like this one. And what I would like to ask you about is there is a step on accountability. And when we think about some of the institutional harms that we see across our country in a very politically charged climate across various landscapes, and the institution's participation, what are some of the ways that you can speak to students, faculty, staff, and invite colleges, universities to this abolitionist step of accountability?
I love that. Well, accountability culture is like the central framework of abolition. In the early days of having conversations around abolition in the public, one of the biggest questions, well, you all just don't want to hold people accountable. I would argue that it's quite the opposite. The idea of the use of police and prisons is actually not accountable. It's not a real form of accountability of anyone who's ever been harmed and have used police structures. You don't actually usually get the justice that you want, nor you deserve. So abolitionist accountability is looking at the root causes of why we end up in the places that we end up. Why are institutions harmful? Why do we individuals cause harm? And harm can look like a lot of things, right? So harm can look like the state's view of harm. So if someone is stealing food from a grocery store and they end up getting arrested and going to jail for it for petty theft. In some states it's petty theft, in others it's not petty theft, and it's a much more intense punishment. We have to look at, well, why was that person going to steal food in the first place? Do they have access to a job? Do they have access to healthy food? Do they have access to cash, right? And so we have to start problematizing how the state looks at harm. But then there's real forms of harm that happen. And those kinds of conversations around murder and rape are actually really important conversations that abolitionists have been having for a long time. There's whole organizations like Insight that were built to look at how to deal with sexual violence in an abolitionist framework. And then you're having this conversation around the institutions, right? We all have inherited the institutions of mostly white supremacy and patriarchy. And so what do you do with that? Because that's real big and not that easy to hold accountable. Well, that's when you build out collectives, and that's when you build out community organizing. Our movement, the progressive movement, is a form of holding racist, patriarchal, ableist institutions accountable. Now, when I say those words, some people make it scared, like, oh no, you're calling me racist, or, here's the thing. At the end of the day, we did not create these places, but we get to reimagine new places and we get to undo these places. And so I really ask people, including myself, I have an American passport. I pay taxes, unfortunately, that go towards a lot of really harmful things. So I try my hardest not to feel guilty for that and instead put myself into an action-oriented place or an abolitionist, imaginative place. And I work with organizations that I think are really building that out. And so every single abolition gives us an opportunity to look at social ills, to look at institutional ills, and come at it from an abolitionist place.
That's really good. And so part of my research, is looking at that moral dilemma of stealing and cases in which poor Black mothers, including my own, would sometimes bend rules and break laws in order to survive or to make a way out of no way. And when we look at dominant systems of appraisals, we tend to look at that moral agency, those survival strategies, as vice, as criminal, as deviant. And so I'm interested in the ways in which we can look to the survival strategies of poor Black mothers, particularly when breaking the law, and instead glean what's virtuous about those actions and how do they interrogate larger structural injustices, right? And moves us away from individual blame. And that is an abolitionist project. So thank you for stating that.
Of course.
I want to kind of shift to art. What was your earliest recollection of your journey as an artist, and how do you see art as a medium for community organizing?
I love that question. My earliest recollection is my great-grandmother's living room. My great-grandmother's living room all of her carpet was covered in plastic.
Some of y'all don't know about that.
I can remember the sound and the feeling of the plastic underneath my feet. And I would,
Oh, thank you.
okay, that's good. Oh yeah, lots of water, thank you. My sister and I would put the sheet on our head and we make it like long hair, and my grandmother was very well traveled and she would bring us back clothes from all the places we traveled, and we would do these fashion shows for her. And I just remember her really robust cackle. We have a very similar laugh. And she would just praise us, and I remember my grandmother telling me, oh, you're a dancer, I'm going to put you into dance classes. So she was one of the first people to name me as an artist. I didn't know that was a thing. I just knew what felt good in my body, and that was movement and dance. And so I think that memory is probably like 7, 8 years old.
Nice. And how has that evolved to a platform, a medium for resistance?
Well, I see art as so my art practice is an extension of my political values. I don't necessarily make, quote, political art. I use art as an extension of processing the really deep amount of CPTSD that comes with being Black in America. And I also see it as a form of deep resilience. I do believe if I didn't make art, I wouldn't have survived this place. Art becomes like a place of deep survival and thriving. And I think that any marginalized group, especially inside of this country, that makes art is a form. Our making is a form of resistance. Our making is a declarative of taking up space in a place that tells us we have no space to take up. And so art becomes that extension of us, and so for some of us, an extension of us when we don't feel like we can be active an activist. And art for me has also been a place of, there's a difference, I think, of doing like a political speech or making art and then like showing up for that art piece and it being able to move you in a way that sometimes words can't and don't. And so I think art becomes a very important medium in reshaping and reorganizing our very being, but also reshaping and reorganizing society's being.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm thinking about the art performance that Patrisse did yesterday. How many people were there? It was extremely powerful, the ways in which you combine art and spirituality and this kind of invoking of the ancestors through this ritual of libation. And I'm wondering, in that space at the Spencer, thank you for your partnership, I'm wondering, what did that space feel like for you in bringing all these various dimensions that's important to your identity? What did that feel like for you?
Integrative. I think, especially when you're in institutions like these, we often are disintegrated. You know, all the different parts of us almost are not allowed to belong. I think I may have said this on the strip, or maybe not. Maybe I said it somewhere else, but I don't know how to not be my whole self. And so it's always been a very odd thing being in the world as a young working class Black woman, because it was this way in which I was told, whether it was by words or by demonstration, that I couldn't be all of me. And so I think yesterday was really powerful for me personally, because it feels like a lot of my work is starting to deeply integrate my spiritual practice, my art practice, and my political practice. I also think when Black folks specifically honor our ancestors, that's a deep form of resilience and also reclamation. There's a reason why part of the job of chattel slavery was cutting us off from our history and our past. And so reclaiming our ancestry and reclaiming our lineages becomes a deep form of resistance inside of my own spirituality.
Yeah, thank you. Resistance and also healing, right? That integrates the present and past, which is kind of this Sankofa moment that we see in African traditions, right? This kind of looking back. The Sankofa, right? The bird is kind of looking back, but his body is looking forward. So going back to reclaim the things that are needed for us to create a better future, and for what we need in the present, right, in the moment. And so I'm really grateful for, I'm going to lean back to my Black church roots, the ways in which you set the atmosphere, right? The ways in which you set the atmosphere in a space at a predominantly white institution in a town that has an overwhelming Black history, right? A history of a prominent Black population. And to connect this institution to that history through ritual and art was incredible. And so I would never walk into the Spencer Museum the same, because you have set the atmosphere in that space. So thank you. So I want to switch now to spirituality. So you grew up Jehovah's Witness.
I did, wow.
So tell us a little bit about growing up Jehovah's Witness and how you have seen abolition not only connected to art, but also integrative in your spiritual practice. So how does growing up as a Jehovah's Witness inform art and spirituality? I'm sorry, abolition and spirituality for you.
I don't know if Jehovah's Witnesses informed that, but I do think the role of the Kingdom Hall actually became a really important center for me, as some things that I really held on to and some things that I really let go of. And I've done a lot of healing around growing up Jehovah's Witness. And my mom is still a witness, and many of my family members are still witnesses. So I try my hardest to hold space for that religion that is theirs and not mine.
Yeah.
She does not do the same for me, but that is okay. But one thing that is really practiced in the Kingdom Hall is a sense of community. There is a deep, deep sense of community. In fact, much of the way in which I organize has to do with growing up going door to door. I was the 9-year-old knocking on the door, and the religion wasn't the thing that made me feel excited, although I love, the idea of a higher being, and the world is bigger than this, this flesh or this room. But it was the interaction and community that actually I really enjoyed as a young person. So when I told my mom I wanted to be an unbaptized publisher and I wanted to go door to door, and I was probably the youngest unbaptized publisher. I was at 9. I was maybe 11 or 12, because I remember bringing my Bible to school and witnessing to my friends, and making them come to the Kingdom Hall with me. And that was the very foundation for my community organizing work. And there's also an ethos in the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Kingdom Hall, which is, don't stand down from what you believe in. There were thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses that were killed in the Holocaust. They wore the purple triangle, and so there was a lot of history that we were taught as young witnesses about how standing strong in your faith and being committed. And so I grew up, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to really be in the public domain and the political domain, so I didn't grow up doing the what is it called, the flag.
Pledge
of
Allegiance.
Allegiance.
That's how much I don't
Yes,
remember,
right.
because I didn't grow up doing it. The Pledge of Allegiance. So, everybody, there was a time, I don't know if Kansas still does it, but in California, you had to do the Pledge of Allegiance in public school every morning. And I remember just being so proud and sitting in my seat and being like, this is like so important. So that, I think, conviction really helped me in my transition out of the Kingdom Hall and into like my own faith practice, and also my political practice, to be like, oh, these are the things I believe in, and I have a lot of conviction around it. So I would say that is what helped shape it. And then you said something else that I'm not remembering.
Yeah, to add on to that, walk us through what the evolution looked like for you to be raised Jehovah's Witness and now practicing as a priestess. And how does Ifa in the Yoruba tradition inform abolition for you?
Absolutely. It was quite, it was a very organic transition from this very, very intense religion, Jehovah's Witness, into an African spirituality, a West African spirituality, that in some ways was deeply demonized by the Kingdom Hall, but I knew it was not, that wasn't true for me. That's not what I was seeing in the tradition. And in my early 20s, I got my first reading by a Babalawo, which is a male priest in the tradition. And I was like, this is what I want to practice. This feels deeply resonant. This feels ancestral. It felt like a reclamation of parts of myself. And from there, I really did ask a lot of questions about spirituality and its role inside of movements. I'm a trained Marxist, and all of Marxism actually denies religion. And so a few of us young organizers actually wrote an entire, maybe 100-page document called The Spiritual Question. And it was a challenge to this idea that spirituality doesn't belong in the left or in movement or even in Marxism, and that dialectical materialism is the only format in which you can make change. And our challenge to that was, what about indigenous communities and our relationship to animism? And so I think in my evolution of both a spiritual practitioner, abolitionist, and artist, I don't see them as these separate entities. They feel like a tapestry to me, and they feel like they're all necessary in the way that I show up in the world, and also in the way that I communicate what I believe in. Yeah.
Well, that's really good. I love how you're bringing in theory, Marxist thought, this kind of socialist political critique of capitalism, as a way to inform your practices of resistance and abolition. Religion being the opiate of the people, right? So I really liked, you were at my class yesterday, and I really liked how you started with an abolition meditation. I wish we had time for you to walk us through that abolition meditation. And then you invited our students to bring out their devices, to Google what is the police budget in Kansas, by the way, who are trained here at KU, right? And also to imagine, right, that abolition imagination, what are some reallocations or other ways that we can invest our spending. And students said everything from investing, and some of our students are here, investing in shelter for the houseless, ensuring that no more public schools are closed, and there was just a list of things. But what I really admired about that practice is that as we were ending in this orientation toward abolition imagination, it began with abolition meditation, right? And oftentimes when we think about spirituality, we can over spiritualize it, right? We can over spiritualize religion as this tool that's just confessional, right? And so I love the way in which you activated this abolition spirituality to orient us towards resistance, towards imagination, right? So I really like what you're doing with abolition meditation and abolition spirituality. And I'm thinking about the losses that you've incurred, right? The losses of rest in peace to your cousin Keenan Anderson, to your father, and the ways in which the state has targeted your brother, right? There's been huge loss for you. And so I'm wondering, how has abolition spirituality, abolition and art, all these integrative practices of abolition, how has it created a space for healing?
Yeah, thank you for that. We just lost another one of our family members a couple weeks ago. Bone cancer. He was 35 years old. His name was Michael Bricknett. Yeah, and I think this is not. I'm not an anomaly. This is really what, unfortunately, Black life looks like under this system. It's a lot of death. It's a lot of sickness, and it's not because we deserve it, and it's not really our fault. It's really the conditions that we've been born inside of. And so, in some ways, I would say that like the activism, the organizing, the spirituality, and the abolition is what keeps me together. It's this idea that even though my immediate family may not be able to reap the benefits of an abolitionist future, my hope is that my lineage will. And I imagine that that's how a lot of people who were born into captivity inside chattel slavery, or people who are experienced the growing up poor and Black in this country, feel if we get the privilege of becoming community organizers. I think it's an honor to do the work that I've done, to know that we could reshape the system instead of thinking that it's our fault, to imagine that the work that I'm doing is not me. I may not ever experience it, but that someone will, and that is quite hopeful for me, and it gives me a lot of clarity. I remember sitting with Angela Davis in 2022 when my book came out, and she, the Abolitionist Handbook, and she said she never thought she'd see abolition in popular culture, let alone, she was, they were sitting in these tiny rooms talking about the prison industrial complex, and editors of newspapers were laughing at them, and now this is a very public dialogue, this conversation of abolition, and so there's so much possibility if we collectivize it. There's so much possibility, and so that's, I think, how I process the immense amount of grief that I feel every day. I don't think anybody who's Black in America doesn't feel an immense amount of grief on a daily basis because of the conditions that we are still living under. And I think for me, as someone who's taken on law enforcement as part of, for now almost 12 years, I spent all of my 30s, I spent all of my 20s and all of my 30s taking on law enforcement. So I'm 40 now, so it's been 20 years. And then, I just read about a young boy in Chicago who was shot 97 times by the Chicago Police Department at a traffic stop. You can't help but feel the weight of that and the suffering of that and the grief of that. And my hope is that there's a legacy that many of us have built on top of another legacy that will help us eventually have a roadmap towards liberation.
Yeah. I just want to just publicly share my deep appreciation for the work that you've done for this country. The unprecedented activism and organizing that you've done to ensure that Black lives matter. And so I am honored to be your friend, to have journeyed with you over these 10 years. And I'm getting chills just thinking about just how powerful that Patrisse Cullors was born during this time, to be there for us and to lead us in such an incredible way that re-galvanized our fervor for abolition and for freedom, and for the validation of the human dignity and humanity of Black life. So thank you, sis.
Thank you, love.
Thank you. So before I go through my rapid round, what's next for you?
I have my first solo show in June. I'm very excited about it. I'm making spiritual weapons. They're dedicated to the Black women in my life who have either not been able to protect themselves or died being unprotected, or the Black women who've protected me. So it's really in honor of the Orisha or goddess named Oya, which is the Orisha of the winds. You all have her here often in Kansas. And she is one of the only goddess warriors. In fact, in our tradition, we would call her trans. At one point, she transitions into a king, and she is just this amazing warrior that yields this beautiful sword. And so I'm building all these swords in dedication to her and dedication to the Black women in my life around protection.
Outstanding. I hope we can all support that project when you give birth to it.
Thank you.
All right, rapid question. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear these words, okay? Ready?
I'm ready.
You sure?
Yep.
All right. Joy.
Aww.
Yes.
Audience, you're the judges. Are we accepting that?
The first word.
The future.
Abolition.
Love.
My child.
Art.
All possibilities.
California.
Ooh. Sunshine.
KU.
Sweet.
Me.
Aww.
Beyonce.
Oh my God. I want to do every dance right now. I want us to collectively get up and go on the lawn and just do the dance to Cowboy Carter for the rest of the evening. 80 minutes, let's go.
Thank you so much.